Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music, any old way you choose it.
Hey guys, this is Katie with Vintage and Vinyl, back with another great video for you today. And in this video, we are continuing with Katie and her camera. I have been reading through this 1953 book by Lois Holbert. It is a romance novel for young moderns. And this trend was started by Misty over at Thrifter Junker Vintage Hunter, who's been selling a lot of these saucy books in her live sales, and they are so much fun. And I got this book from Nicole at Nesting Haven, so I'm excited to continue reading through this book. We have about 1 page to 2 pages left in chapter 1 to finish up, and then we will go through chapter 2. And what I'm going to be doing is reading a chapter a week. That way it's easier and we can follow along by the chapters. So if you're interested in my new intro to my videos, my good friend Frank Balzano drew that little caricature of me and I thought it was so cute. What a nice surprise. Frank, if you are watching, thank you so much. You are so talented and I'm excited to add that into the beginning of all of my videos. So let's go ahead and jump in and read Katie and Her Camera by Lois Holbert. It seemed princely to Katie. Yes, she could begin this minute, but could she call her mother first and tell her she had a job? Don't think there isn't plenty of routine and dull work in this business, Esperon warned her when she hung up. In fact, that's what we'll begin with, sorting and numbering negatives and prints. He carried over batches of each to the big work table and laid them out, shoving aside books and papers. He showed her a system of numbering negatives and matching them with the corresponding prints. After the first batch, under his supervision, he left her on her own and went into the darkroom. Soon she was so intent on inking the numbers on the negatives that she missed a knock at the door and glanced up with a start only when the door opened. It was a tall man in a tan trench coat. Esperon here? Oh yes, he's in the darkroom. She knocked at the darkroom door, heard a mumble, and turned to offer a chair. With a blush, she snatched up some socks and undershirts from the nearest chair and looked for a place to put them. Won't you sit down? I'm sure he'll be right out. Thanks. There was an amused undertone in the man's voice, but his face was expressionless. Why not stick those in the hamper in the bathroom over there? He suggested. Don't worry about me. I'll make myself comfortable. He unbelted his coat and threw it over a chair, picked up a magazine, and began to leaf through it. Katie resumed her numbering, inwardly noting that he looked as if he'd be comfortable and a little amused wherever he was. His very nose, it was a long one. It wore a swagger. He looked like a pirate, she decided, a little too brash for her taste. Mr. Esperon came out, towelless this time, with damp hands, and clapped the other man on the shoulder. Paul, good to see ya. When did you get back? I thought you'd be away another week. Oh, it was a false alarm. I gave it up and came back to hunt for some new leads. Say, Ralphie, when are you moving into a decent place? Can't you at least get a maid to clean up the studio? How do you expect anyone to work in such clutter? Well, I guess you are used to it. I can't find any skylight studios, Esperon complained. Oh, and one of these days I'll find a cleaning woman. Catherine, if you know of anyone, call her up and ask her to come over tomorrow. Will you? Had lunch yet, Paul? I knew I'd forgotten something. I'm starving. Good, there's a little Italian place just around the corner. He was putting on a leather jacket when he thought of introductions. Oh, Catherine, this is Paul Serrell, the Herald. You know, Catherine Owens, my new assistant. Obviously. By the way, Catherine, did you have anything to eat? Yes, she assured him just before her appointment, and the two men left. She finished with the negatives, checked them for accuracy, and carefully filed them away. What next? She eyed the room critically. It might not be too bad if this were tidied up a bit. There wasn't too much to mark it as living quarters if she closed the kitchenette off, got rid of some of the confusion and clutter. Into the crowded hamper went the soiled underclothes. He He probably needed someone to remind him about a laundry service, too. She found hangers for the trousers and a coat in the closet, and then she went to work on the books. What a hodgepodge they were! Some of her own favorites, though. Proust, Shaw, Thurber, Alice in Wonderland, the Gilbert Murray translations of the Sophocles, T.S. Eliot, Margaret Mead, a lot of history and philosophy, and some books in an unfamiliar language, Swedish or Danish. An eclectic mind, all right. The papers she assembled and stacked neatly on the work table. Next to the file cabinet, she found a hi-fi unit with records piled in a heap in front of it. The records she found belonged in the lower shelves where he kept the art and photography books. She straightened out the couch cover, plumped up the pillow against the wall, moved a table and chair against the wall, and then stood back to view the effect. Not too unbusinesslike now, but the dust! As she fetched a dirty towel from the hamper, she suddenly began to feel qualms that Mr. Esperon might be angry at the rearrangement and consider it an intrusion. Well, she gave her head a pony shake. If he could be neat and orderly about his darkroom, he could be neat about living too. And she was still dusting when they returned. "Paul, look!" Esperon staggered and clutched his chest in mock horror. "The woman's touch, it always turns into a grip. Now my home is no longer my own to mess up as I please." "What did I tell you?" said Paul triumphantly. "There's a girl who sees her duty and does it. Now give me that book you told me about and I'll clear out." Esperon plucked it instantly from the upper reaches of one of the bookcases and flipped it to him. "If I were you, I'd pay off those gamblers. They play rough." "If you were me, you'd go right ahead, and you know it," Paul retorted with a grin. "So long. Goodbye, Catherine. Or is it Kathy?" "Katie," she answered automatically, and then was annoyed and showed it by her prim. "Goodbye, Mr. Serrell." He raised his eyebrows. "Formal type? That won't last long around here." And he closed the door and went whistling down the dim corridor. New friends, old friends. The sun's rays reached Rosalie into the dining room while Katie told her mother and Kenny about the new job at Mr. Esperon. He wasn't the most elegant person in the world, she admitted, but he seemed awfully nice and kind, and she had a feeling it would turn out to be much more interesting than other jobs she had applied for. Kenny, bolting down food as fast as he could chew in order to escape from more football, promptly requested lessons in photography. "There are 34 million camera users in the United States," he informed her with authority. "Can I borrow your box camera for Scouts tomorrow?" "And run it," Katie said sharply. "I should say not. It's the only camera I have." "Mother, did you ever hear of someone named Paul Serrell? He's a friend of Mr. Esperon's, and I gathered I should have known the name." "Certainly, dear. If you read the newspapers more thoroughly, you'd know of him too. He's been doing articles on the teacher shortages in the schools. He's a feature writer for the Herald, and a very good one." "He thinks so too," Katie said with some asperity, and then she relapsed into good humor. "It's wonderful to have a job and be able to go back to the university. Do you think we can afford to keep the car? If I carry passengers to school every day, it will almost pay for itself, and we've always used a car so much that it would be a pity to sell it." "Maybe," Mrs. Owen said doubtfully, "but do you think you can manage work and classes and study all at once? Maybe it would have been wiser to look for a full-time job and save your money to finish school later." Katie shook her head. "Then I'd probably never get around to going back. If other people can work and study at the same time, then there is no reason why I can't. But no more tennis after dinner, I guess," she said with a little sigh. She began clearing the table, Kenny helping. "Anyhow, Dad would have been pleased at my going back to the university. He always said you shouldn't start something unless you're ready to finish it." Mrs. Owens fell silent. Her mobile face, like Katie's, mirrored every mood, and her blue eyes were deep in the past, while her fingers went on sponging dishes and slipping them into the drying rack. Katie, with her sensitivity to every emotional shift, caught her nostalgia. "I saw Mrs. Clark watering her lawn on my way home," she remarked, drying the silver. "She wanted you to come over and play cards tonight. Or why don't you call her and go to a movie instead? I'll finish the dishes, and then I want to get some things ready for school tomorrow. Go on, run along now." Smiling at Katie's diplomacy, Mrs. Owens flicked the water from her hands, dried them, and untied her apron. "I'd love to. Are you sure you won't mind?" When her mother left, Katie put away the dishes, closed the cupboards, and went slowly upstairs to her room. She didn't feel like doing anything much. She turned on the radio and lay down on her bed, the plaid bait spread crumpling underneath her. She listened to, the sedate for Pavin for a Dead Princess? She could guess by her own melancholy how deep her mother's was. How swiftly things had changed since her father's death. No more leisurely walks to church with Dad, chatting about books. No more long auto trips with the family to the Black Hills or Canada or the Eastern Seaboard. No more long summers at the cottage at Lake Minnetonka. That was sold. No father to discuss problems with and give counsel or pay the bills. The pension didn't go far each month, and Kenny had to finish school. And what would happen when the insurance money was gone? Would Katie then be earning enough to support the family? Her mother talked about getting a job, and it might be wise, not only financially, but because it would keep her busy and bring her into contact with other people. But perhaps she wasn't physically strong enough yet. In any case, it was lucky that her mother had always held a tight rein on the family finances and was strict about allowances, so the children had never taken dimes or dollars for granted. But Katie still didn't know what she wanted to do for a living. Teach, be a secretary or salesgirl or librarian? As a child, she always vaguely entertained a vision of herself as a writer, painter, dancer, or someone creative and important. But those dreams had a way of subsiding in the harshness of daylight. No good moping about it. Katie sat up on her bed and went to her desk to search for her last year's notebook. The immediate thing was to learn as much as she could, in college and on the job, and to thrust down the uncertainties, find out what she could do. Her typing would always come in handy, and if worse came to worse, she could always resort to office work. It was good to be back in the familiar halls, especially since she had so nearly been able to return. Listening to the lecturer's voice, the scratchings of pens and pencils in the notebooks, the laughter and talking of students in the halls by the windows. A small breeze puffed the green blinds against the windows. Katie watched the girl next to her in class in between her note-taking. Renaissance, distinguished by a variety of skill and craftsmen, major influences. Surveying the brown hair at the scalp and the bright hair curling crisply outward. With so many natural blondes on campus, bleached hair was a rarity and a source of mild curiosity. When the lecturer chalked the next assignment on the board and collected his notes, the yellow-haired girl closed her notebook, embossed in gold with the letters DLC, with a careless flop of the pages. Briefly smiling, she returned the pencil she had borrowed from Katie. Caught in the crowd of students, they moved together down the aisle toward the double doors. The girl's name was Diana Caldwell, she said. She was, as Katie suspected, an out-of-state student from Connecticut. No, she had no friends in town and knew no one except the people she was staying with. They were friends of her father's. Katie asked how she happened to be going to school in the Middle West, and Diana laughed. "My father decided I'd been thrown out of enough schools in the East," she answered with perfect good humor and composure. "So he sent me here to see if a university could take me more in stride. He thought I was spending too much time in the nightclubs and not enough in class." "Oh, it's true," she added, smiling at Katie's flicker of skepticism. "I'm on the blacklist of 4 colleges, and the deans have gone through every stage of feeling sorry for the poor little rich girl with the playboy father, and of getting exasperated by her planks, and finally being outraged by the little fiend's sheer brattiness." Coming down the steps, they made their way through another tide of students, and Diana's gaze, quite frankly, singled out and appraised the men. Most of them returned the compliment with zest. "Nice tall men you have around here," she observed approvingly. Disconcerted by Diana's attitude, Katie was uncertain how to respond. Her candor, casual and matter-of-fact enough to carry conviction, undermined by the conventional amenities that Katie was used to, and it seemed to place the girls on an oddly intimate basis of acquaintance. At the same time, she apparently required nothing of Katie, invited no response, and even seemed indifferent. Katie, to whom dates in nightclubs automatically conferred and symbolized sophistication, was rather intimidated by the obvious gulf in their existence. Yet she found herself liking the other girl. Something about Diana, a touch of ironic whimsy perhaps? A take-it-or-leave-it attitude? It was rather engaging. On impulse, she asked Diana to come to lunch with her, explaining that she was meeting a friend, but that they often bring other people along. If it's another girl, she wouldn't be much interested. If it's a man, she wouldn't be very pleased. Besides, Diana glanced at her watch. "I'm afraid I haven't time. Can I give you a lift somewhere?" "No." "All right. See you in class next week." The arrogance of the girl, Katie thought, as she unlocked the family car and drove a few blocks down University Avenue. And yet, she didn't seem unfriendly. As she parked the car in front of the tea room, a Coral Studebaker passed by, Diana Caldwell at the wheel. Louise was at the table buttering a roll when Katie arrived. "No one else has come," she announced while Katie studied the menu. "Do you think anyone will remember us from last year and drop in to see us?" Thursday lunch at the tea room had become a minor institution among their circle, initiated as a weekly date between the two girls. It had gradually swollen into a gathering because of Katie's habit of inviting acquaintances and friends on impulse as she met them in class or on campus. So any of their friends who had some free time might turn up, knowing that Katie and Louise would be there as a nucleus. Katie had finished telling Louise about Diana Caldwell and was launching into a description of her new job when Stan Levin spotted their table and pulled up a chair to join them. "Wondered if I'd find you here," he remarked. "Aren't either of you taking any journalism classes this year?" He was a square-jawed young man with glasses who had this year been approved instructor in the School of Journalism. Not many undergraduates had an instructor's company at lunch. Katie wondered whether Stan's presence might have some connection with Louise, and that gentle, serious, nearsighted gaze of hers that made you feel no one in the world had such absorbing problems or made such of a perceptive and witty comments as you did. Not that Stan was obvious about it. At the moment, he was interested in Katie's new job. With Ralph Esperon, the photographer? Katie was gratified by his tone of respect, and her self-esteem rose a full degree. "Yes," she said. "Do you know of him?" "Of him? Certainly. He's done some very fine things in photojournalism." "What's photojournalism?" Katie inquired. Stan gave her one of those "bless you, child" my looks. Photojournalism is the fancy dress term for a picture story. That's a story based mainly on photographs instead of text, like Eugene Smith's story of a country doctor. You see him visiting the patients, performing an operation, and sipping on some coffee in exhaustion afterwards. The pictures tell the real story, and the captions relate them or point up the details. "That sounds interesting," said Louise. "You mean the sort of thing we see every week in Life and Look?" "That's it. How's it, Katie, that you work for one of the finest photographers in the country, and you don't know much about photography?" Katie bristled in self-defense. "Well, I just began this week, and all I've done so far is type up bills, file prints, and answer the telephone. Mr. Esperon has been so busy in the darkroom that we've scarcely talked at all." "You might be a contact for me. Do you suppose he'd speak to a journalism class here next month?" I don't know, but I'll ask for you. I'm lining up some good speakers, an editor from the New York Times, a printer, and Cyril from the Herald. Oh, he's a friend of Mr. Esperon's. When is he speaking? I'll have to check the date, but come over if you like. Guests will be welcome. I'll send you a notice of it. Oh, thanks, Sam, but don't bother. I'm not really too interested. Sorry, but I've got to run along now. See you later. Neither Stan nor Louise exactly showed signs of dismay, she thought, amused. For once, Mr. Esperon wasn't buried in the darkroom when she arrived. He was lying on the couch smoking and hardly noticed her entrance. By now, she knew where to find whatever she needed, so she pulled out the portable typewriter and went to work. There was a stack of photographs waiting to be sent out. A name was clipped to each batch. She stamped them with his credit line on the back, typed up an actual caption, put them in manila envelopes with cardboard inserts. She weighed and stamped each one, photographs, and put on the postage. There were a lot of addresses to look up, mainly in the New York telephone book, and Katie decided to keep a list for future reference. Mr. Esperon got up and began roaming restlessly around the room. Can you take dictation on a typewriter, Katie? Good. I want to make some notes for a picture story. It's all about machines. What was the first machine? Get model of Leonardo da Vinci's inventions and other early machines. Machines that have been part of dramatic events like the Spirit of St. Louis. Which are the most widely used machines? What is the smallest? What is the largest? Which are the weirdest looking? How to pictorialize the elements of a machine. How do people react to machines? How are they patented? Then references. Norbert Weiner's The Cybernetics, The Human Use of Human Beings, Leonardo's Notebooks, some poem about the revolt of machines by Stephen Vincent Bernay, Rue by Capek, and Elmer's Rice, The Adding Machine. You do so much reading and research for these stories, Katie asked, surprised. Oh, they vary. Some require a lot and some little or none. Some magazines, have a photographer, researcher, writer team. They work together. Esperon sat down by Katie's table, resting his crossed arms on the back of a chair. You must do a fair amount of research for your college papers, Katie. How would you like to do some research for me on this story? You've got things pretty well in order here and can afford to spend a few afternoons in the library. It's no rush. You can take your time on this. She said yes, of course, but looked a little crestfallen. He surmised her disappointment and grinned. Seems as if you're getting everything but photography, doesn't it? All right, there's still some processing to do. It's too late to start now, but tomorrow you can take a whack at it. Feel better now? She was delighted and bubbled over with expectancy. Sensing, too, that Esperon was in a chatty mood, she ventured on a comment to draw him out. I had no idea so much preparation went into these stories. Well, that's not always the case. Some stories seem to roll right out of the lens. You find a story that tells itself and you simply follow it up. Some photographers have a genius for working that way, but for me, it's rare. I like to do real studies, feel that I know the subject and the background thoroughly. It's hard work, but it's satisfying. What gives you the idea for a story? Katie asked. You never know. You might be reading something and wonder how it would look interpreted by pictures. You might want to put an idea or an emotion into pictorial form. You might see a story producing itself right on the street. A little boy doing stunts to show off for a little girl. A gang fight developing among some youngsters. Or two women gossiping over the fence. Sometimes going over old prints gives you an idea for a series of pictures. Say, animals or people who look alike. There's no way of pinning an idea down to one source or mood, and you can't always nail one when you want it either. But getting the spark for a really original idea is half the battle. He paused. It's a good thing I hired you instead of that boy. Last night I had dinner with a publisher who wants me to do a book on photography, stressing the creative rather than the technical aspects. I said I'd give it a try. Maybe you could edit it for me as well as take dictation. Would you like that? Good. I'll probably be using you as a sounding board throughout the book. Like it. Katie was thrilled at the prospect of being even humbly involved with writing a book, even more at the idea of learning so directly about the creative side of photography. Too many people think photography is simply a matter of knowing the techniques and having the right equipment, Esperon went on, but it's far more complicated than that. Look at the magnificent work done by people like Brady, Julia Cameron, and Lewis Carroll in the Victorian era with nearly impossible equipment. Look! He reached over to the shelves and pulled out a book of old photographs and flipped through the pages, showing her what he meant. She was amazed to discover that Lewis Carroll was not only a writer, mathematician, but an expert photographer. They didn't have the equipment, but these people had imagination, understanding of their subject, awareness, and a sense of line, qualities you need to become a first-rate photographer. He interrupted himself to look anxiously at Katie. Are you really interested in all of this? I mean, I can go on for hours, you know. The eagerness in her eyes was assurance enough, but suddenly he veered off in another direction. You're not finding this work too much for you. You have enough time for your classes and studies and dates and all that. So far, it hasn't interfered at all, and I seem to organize my time a little bit better. Besides, I don't spend much time on dates, so she stopped, embarrassed, finding him studying her with a quizzical look. Picking up the stack of mail, she tried a diversion. I'll drop these off on... Hold on a minute, Katie. What do you mean you don't date much? You don't want to, or you don't get asked? She was flustered and pink-faced, yet felt compelled to answer. Oh, it's only that I'm a little shy, and my girlfriends are awfully good company, and I don't miss... Well, most boys I find less interesting than... He eyed her shrewdly. A little of both, I suspect. Now, why should a pretty, intelligent, responsive girl like you lack for dates? Are you a bookworm? Are your interests limited? No, she was indignant. I love swimming and tennis and bowling and music and chess and going to plays and enough, enough! You can talk back when roused. That's good. Then what's the trouble? Domineering mother? Does she expect too much of you? Set standards for you or disapprove of your boyfriends? Oh no, said Katie, shocked. She's always very nice to them, and she has definite ideas, all right. But I do too, and well, they're often very different. But we've always gotten along okay. Ah, Esperon had an interested look of an entomologist expecting a new variety of moth. He tipped his chair forward. When you were little, did you read a great deal? Usually things that were advanced for your age, for older children? Yes, I thought so. And I dare say your girlfriends are rather like you. That is, intelligent, interested in a variety of things, and possibly good at sports. You are, aren't you? Not precisely glamorous or sophisticated, to use some wretched words, and probably a little lofty about dates. Maybe even a tiny bit prissy and proper, take themselves some mite too seriously. Maybe they're not glamorous or sophisticated, but they are attractive, Katie said fiercely, and they're not proper or prissy, and they do have a sense of humor. She was annoyed at Esperon for grinning at her. You feel any reflection on them is a reflection on you, too. It's funny, Katie. The only thing you will ever catch anyone admitting to is not having a sense of humor. Want to know what I think about you? She wasn't sure she did, but, well, that didn't stop Esperon. Katie, my dear, if you're going to work with me, you might as well get used to my ways and learn to put up with them. Here's my guess, and I could be wrong, remember, but you think it over because you are too nice a girl to get sidetracked. I think you're one of those youngsters who read everything in sight and develop much faster and mentally and socially or emotionally. You have very little patience with boys of your own age, and you expect too much of them. You're not mature enough to be quite right for an older man who is discriminating. So what happens? You turn down the dates you could have and are too proper or ethical or delicate or something to go after the kind of man who would interest you. You manage to keep busy and don't think about it much and are afraid to put yourself to the test, right? Katie's face was burning red and she was speechless. Not even her father had ever talked to her so plainly. Esperon patted her kindly on the shoulder, got up and fetched her coat and helped her into it with an uncustomized gallantry. "Look, Katie, don't take me too seriously," he said. "That's a pretty big chunk of amateur analysis to digest, and I shouldn't have thrown it at you like that. Wait, don't forget your purse or you'll be stranded." She managed a wispy shadow of a smile. Esperon gave her one parting admiration. "Just don't develop a sour grapes attitude. I'm wrong, and forget it. See if you can crack that reserve of yours a little." So I hope you guys enjoyed this week's reading of Katie and Her Camera. I think the story's coming along very well. I am so interested to see what happens between Katie and Esperon. My bet is that they end up together and maybe the mother won't like the age difference. I'm not sure, but I am just guessing along with you all. I have not read any farther. I read these every week in front of you just as you see, so I am learning as you do as well. So I hope you guys have a great week. Stay tuned for future videos coming up. I will be doing Thriftmas in July with Nicole at Nesting Haven, so that video will be up on my channel this Thursday at 2 p.m. And I hope you all will stay safe, stay in, and binge YouTube.